Edman Eric Gleed was a man whose identity remained unknown for more than 31 years after his remains were discovered, until investigators used modern forensic methods to finally establish who he was. His case is an example of how long unresolved unidentified remains can eventually be linked to a missing person. On November 29, 1993, a body was found floating in the water near the east side of the Clearwater Pass Bridge, a location near Clearwater Beach, Florida. The remains were recovered by local authorities, and nearby on the beach at a lifeguard stand, a neatly folded pile of clothing was discovered. There was no identification found on the body or in the clothing, and therefore police could not determine who the man was at that time. At the scene, the Pinellas County Medical Examiner's Office examined the body and conducted an autopsy, but the examination proved inconclusive regarding the cause and manner of death. Although no signs pointed to obvious foul play, the medical examiner was unable to definitively determine how the man had died. Because his identity could not be established, the unidentified individual was entered into records as Pinellas County John Doe, 1993. Based on the physical evidence examined in 1993, the medical examiner classified the body as that of a white male with blue eyes and short gray hair, estimated to be between 60 and 80 years old, standing approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing about 118 pounds. There were no fingerprints or other identifiers that could link the remains to a known missing person at the time. While the remains were logged and stored by law enforcement, and the case was recorded in unidentified persons databases, no immediate investigative breakthroughs occurred. Over the years, the identity of the man remained unknown. No credible leads emerged tying the unidentified remains to a missing person case, and the mystery persisted for more than 3 decades. In the years following 1993, investigative technology advanced substantially. In particular, investigative genetic genealogy became a tool that allowed law enforcement agencies and forensic scientists to revisit cold cases involving unidentified remains. Investigative genetic genealogy uses DNA obtained from remains and compares it to large public genetic databases to find distant relatives and build family trees that can lead to an identification. In 2024 and 2025, the Clearwater Police Department worked in collaboration with nonprofit forensic genealogy specialists from Moxie Forensic Investigations and other partners to re-examine the frozen DNA sampled from the unidentified remains. DNA was processed to create a genetic profile that could be compared with profiles in genealogy databases such as GED Match Pro, where individuals voluntarily share their genetic data. Investigative geneticists began locating DNA matches that appeared to be distantly related to the unidentified man. Surprisingly, most of the initial matches were traced to people living in or who had recently immigrated from England, a finding unexpected for a man found in Florida. Analysts traced these DNA connections through generations, linking ancestor lines back to families in Bristol, England in the mid-1700s. This genealogical research formed the basis for developing potential family trees and narrowing down an identity candidate. Once a likely candidate was identified, investigators located a living next of kin, the son of the candidate, who resided in North Carolina. Law enforcement obtained a buccal swab from the son for DNA comparison. When the son's DNA was compared with the genetic profile developed from the unidentified remains, the test confirmed a parent-child relationship, establishing that the unidentified body was that of Edman Eric Gleed. Edman Eric Gleed was born on July 29, 1909, and was 84 years old at the time of his death in November 1993. Prior to his disappearance, he had lived in Falls Church, Virginia, where he resided with his son. On November 27, 1993, Gleed was reported missing to the Fairfax County Police Department after he left his home for a routine morning walk and did not return. His son filed the missing persons report shortly after he vanished. At the time of his disappearance, family members noted that Gleed may have been experiencing early stages of dementia, a condition that could affect memory and decision-making. Despite reporting him missing, authorities at the time in Virginia did not immediately connect his disappearance to the body that was later found in Florida. It would take more than 30 decades for law enforcement agencies to link the two. Gleed's body was discovered 2 days after he went missing, but the geographic separation, roughly 1,000 miles from Virginia to Florida, prevented investigators in the 1990s from making a direct connection between the missing person report and the unidentified remains. The folded clothing and lack of identification meant that conventional investigative methods failed to produce a match at the time. After the genealogical identification was confirmed in June 2025, the Clearwater Police Department formally notified Gleed's son, who was 94 years old. Officials stated that identifying the body had provided both answers and some measure of closure for the family after decades of not knowing what had happened to him. Deputy Chief Michael Wallach commented on the satisfaction of delivering answers and closure for the family. Agencies involved in the identification expressed appreciation for the contributions of volunteer genealogists, members of genetic databases, and forensic partners. The response to the case highlighted the role of community participation in contributing DNA data to public platforms that can assist law enforcement in cold cases. The collaboration with Moxie Forensic Investigations and Intermountain Forensics was specifically noted as instrumental in generating the genetic profile and establishing the connection to living relatives. Officials also acknowledged that despite the identification, the circumstances leading to Gleed's presence in Florida and the exact reason for his death remain uncertain. The autopsy from 1993 still did not provide a definitive cause of death, and investigators have stated that there is no indication of foul play based on the available evidence, though the lack of conclusive determination leaves some questions unaddressed. The case of Edmund Eric Gleed underscores how modern forensic tools can solve long-standing mysteries involving unidentified remains. Investigative genetic genealogy has been applied in multiple cold cases in recent years, allowing law enforcement to revisit evidence that was once thought to be insufficient for identification. By comparing DNA from historical remains with genetic data submitted by distant relatives, investigators are increasingly able to bridge the gap between cold cases and missing person reports. Before his identification, Gleed was listed in national databases under the placeholder name Pinellas County John Doe 1993, a designation used for unidentified remains discovered in Pinellas County that have not been linked to a missing person. The resolution of such cases is part of broader efforts by cold case units nationwide to employ modern techniques that were not available at the time the remains were first found. Edmund Eric Gleed's identification brought a decades-long chapter of uncertainty to a close for his family. For 31 years, the remains floated in records as an unidentified man, leaving unanswered questions about his life and death. With the confirmation of his identity, his place in his family's history was re-established, and the record of his disappearance was updated to reflect what was known through both traditional missing persons reporting and contemporary DNA analysis. Gleed's case illustrates both the limitations of investigative technology in the early 1990s and the progress of forensic genealogy in the 2020s. Although law enforcement could not identify him at the time his body was discovered, the preservation of evidence and the development of new analytical methods ultimately made it possible to resolve the mystery more than 30 decades later. Edmund Eric Gleed was born in 1909, disappeared in late November 1993, and was finally identified on June 2, 2025, when investigators confirmed through DNA testing that the unidentified remains found off the Florida coast belonged to him. The identification provided his family with long-awaited confirmation of what had happened to him after he vanished from Virginia in 1993.
In October 1998, the decomposed remains of a woman were discovered in a wooded area behind the Petro truck stop near Interstate 20 in Weatherford, Texas. The date was October 7, 1998, and Tarrant County authorities were notified after a passerby located the remains in the brush. The woman's body was found wearing a blue and white windsuit, a white bra, white or beige underwear, and white socks. Beside her was a large blue shoulder bag containing a long brown wig, a bottle of mineral water, and a pair of beige prescription glasses. Investigators at the scene estimated she had been dead for several weeks before discovery. The Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office assessed the remains and determined that the woman appeared to have suffered a gunshot wound, judging by the presence of a firearm found near her body and forensic evidence at the scene. Based on this evidence, investigators initially treated her death as a suicide. Despite establishing a likely manner of death, law enforcement could not determine her identity. The remains were entered into missing and unidentified persons databases, and her case became known as Weatherford Jane Doe, cataloged in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs, as UP3572. At the time of her discovery, the woman could not be identified through traditional investigative means. She had no identification on her person. There were no missing persons reports clearly linked to her description in the Texas area, and fingerprints were either not available or unable to produce a match. Investigators and forensic artists produced facial reconstructions and disseminated them in hopes that someone might recognize her, but those efforts did not yield definitive leads. The case slowly grew cold as years passed without a confirmed identification. Over the years, there were occasional reviews of the evidence, and portions of the medical records, clothing, and forensic details were preserved in evidence storage. However, the limitations of late 1990s forensic technology and the absence of clear leads meant the woman's identity remained unknown despite inputs from local law enforcement, medical examiners, and national databases. The reconstruction images and case details were shared periodically by cold case units and public records, but none led to a positive identification. In the early 2020s, advances in forensic science, particularly in forensic genetic genealogy, began to yield results in cold, unidentified remains cases where earlier methods had failed. Forensic genetic genealogy combines DNA analysis with genealogical research to trace family relationships and identify unknown individuals by linking them to distant relatives whose genetic information is available in public databases. Law enforcement agencies across the United States increasingly used this method to revisit cold cases. In September 2023, the Weatherford Police Department Cold Case Unit and the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office decided to re-examine the 1998 Jane Doe case using modern DNA technology. They sent preserved evidence, including dental remains or other suitable tissue, to Othram, a laboratory specializing in advanced forensic DNA analysis. Othram scientists were able to extract a usable DNA profile from the remains and generate a comprehensive forensic genetic sequence. Once the DNA profile was established, forensic genetic genealogists conducted a genealogical search using the profile. They compared the unidentified woman's DNA to genetic data in public genealogy databases to find distant familial matches. These preliminary matches allowed genealogists to build potential family trees and trace possible ancestral lines leading toward living relatives. Through this research, leads emerged pointing to relatives of a possible family line, and investigators followed the connections. The genealogical investigation eventually led to identifying a possible relative, a son of the unidentified woman who lived outside Texas. Investigators sought a reference DNA sample from this individual, and when his DNA was compared to the unidentified remains DNA, it produced a positive match. That match allowed authorities to conclude that the Jane Doe whose remains had been found in Weatherford in 1998 was in fact Nellie Faye Red Gillespie. For more than 25 years, Nellie's identity had been unknown to law enforcement and her family. Her son, David Gillespie, had reported his mother missing after losing contact with her in the late 1990s. During those years, he had no confirmation of what happened to her, only the hope that someday the case might be solved. In December 2023, after the forensic genealogy results became clear, Lieutenant Johnny Qualls of the Weatherford Police Department Cold Case Unit and the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office made a phone call to David Gillespie, informing him that his mother's remains had been identified after more than 2 decades of uncertainty. Identification of the remains provided long-sought closure for the family. Law enforcement agencies involved in the case expressed that the use of modern forensic DNA technology had been crucial in achieving this result. The advanced DNA analysis and genealogical research bridged the gap between evidence collected in 1998 and a living relative whose DNA could corroborate the identity. The collaboration between the Cold Case Unit, the Medical Examiner's Office, and Othram's laboratory was central to resolving a case that otherwise might never have had a definitive answer. Despite the identification, some aspects of the case remain matters of record rather than definitive explanation. The Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office, based on the evidence found at the scene and the presence of a firearm near the body, indicated that the most likely manner of Nellie's death was suicide. Investigators had originally noted this assessment in 1998, based on the firearm position and the absence of evidence indicating foul play, and this conclusion remained aligned with the forensic details known from that time. However, because the primary focus of the re-examination was on identifying the woman, agencies did not publicly revise the original conclusion regarding manner of death beyond reaffirming the initial findings. The identification of Nellie Faye Red Gillespie also highlighted how cold case investigations benefit from preserving evidence and periodically reassessing unsolved cases as scientific methods evolve. The remains discovered in 1998 might never have been identified using the forensic tools available at that time, but preservation of dental evidence and other intact material allowed DNA extraction decades later. Without that preserved evidence, connecting the remains to a living relative through genetic genealogy might not have been possible. Following the identification, public records and the NamUs entry for the Jane Doe were updated to reflect Nellie's name and the resolution of her unidentified status. Agencies working on the case emphasized that this resolution was the result of sustained investigative practice combined with novel technology and genealogical cooperation. For the Gillespie family, the identification represented an end to years of unanswered questions about what had happened to their mother. Nellie's case also serves as an example of how cold cases, particularly ones involving unidentified remains, have benefited from the advent of forensic genetic genealogy. Over the past decade, numerous unidentified remains cases that once seemed unsolvable have been resolved by the same methodologies used in Nellie's case, helping families gain answers years after their loved ones disappeared. Cold cases like the one involving Nellie Gillespie illustrate both the challenges of missing persons investigations and the potential for breakthroughs when evidence is preserved and modern science is applied. Her identification in 2023 brought an official name back to a case that had lingered unknown in official records for more than a quarter-century. Nellie Faye Red Gillespie was the woman whose remains were found in October 1998 near Weatherford, Texas. For decades, her identity was unknown, listed only as Weatherford Jane Doe. Through collaborative forensic and genealogical efforts, investigators finally confirmed who she was, bringing closure to her family and updating the historical record of an unresolved cold case.